The scream wasn't human. It was the city itself, tearing at its own seams, a visceral, metallic shriek that ripped through the quiet Tuesday afternoon. Sarah Jenkins, kneeling in the rich, dark soil of her grandmother's rosebed, felt it more than heard it, a concussive wave that slammed into her chest, stealing her breath. Her ceramic trowel clattered uselessly as she instinctively threw her arms over her head, though what protection they could offer against a force that could vibrate her very bones, she couldn't say. Then came the roar. A deep, guttural sound that swallowed the sky, followed by a violent, earth-shaking thump that rattled the very foundations of her quaint, two-story home. A cloud of black smoke, tinged with an angry orange glow, bloomed over the rooftops a few blocks away, boiling upwards like a monstrous toxic mushroom. Gas main. Definitely gas main. The clinical assessment was automatic, a reflex honed over years in the ER. Her heart, however, was anything but clinical. It hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, adrenaline already surging through her veins. This wasn't a car crash or a kitchen fire. This was something on a scale she hadn't seen since that warehouse fire 5 years ago, the one that had left half a block a charred husk. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" A terrified voice shrieked from 2 houses down, followed by a child's panicked wail. Sarah was on her feet, scrambling over the low picket fence, separating her garden from the sidewalk. Her faded scrubs, still tucked into her gardening jeans, felt suddenly prescient. Her neighborhood, usually a sleepy tableau of retirees and young families, was dissolving into chaos. People spilled from their homes, eyes wide with terror and confusion, craning their necks towards the ominous plume. Sirens, a discordant symphony of approaching dread, began to wail from every direction. The air, already heavy with the humid promise of a summer storm, now carried the acrid tang of burnt plastic and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet that Sarah, grimly, recognized as the scent of scorched earth and fear. She moved with purpose, a strange calm descending over her as the chaos mounted around her. This was her element, her perverse calling. Not the gardening, not the quiet contemplation of blooming petals, but the sharp, urgent demand of a crisis. Her eyes, sharp and trained, scanned the scene, looking for immediate needs, for points of intervention. The source of the explosion seemed to be around Elm Street, just 3 blocks east. As she moved, her ears picked up a new sound, one that cut through the general pandemonium. The shouts of men, urgent and clipped. Firefighters. They were already there. Rounding the corner onto Elm, Sarah was hit by the full force of it. The street was a nightmare of twisted metal, shattered glass, and smoldering debris. The air was thick with smoke, stinging her eyes and catching in her throat. A 4-story brick apartment building on the corner had partially collapsed, its facade peeled away like an orange, exposing the raw, messy intestines of ruined homes. And there, amidst the wreckage, were the firefighters. Dark figures moving with practiced precision through the smoky haze, their heavy gear making them seem almost inhuman, creatures forged from smoke and iron. One crew was working on the far side of the building, dousing embers that still flared defiantly. Another group, from Engine 12, was closer, their bright yellow coats smeared with soot, their voices muffled by their masks as they struggled to secure a wobbling section of a retaining wall. It was the retaining wall that separated the apartment building from a narrow alleyway, a precarious structure of ancient brick and crumbling mortar, now severely compromised by the blast. Sarah stopped dead, her nurse's instinct screaming at her. The wall was a ticking time bomb. She watched, frozen for a heartbeat, as one of the younger firefighters, a man with wide, determined shoulders even under his heavy pack, worked with a crowbar, trying to pry loose a section of twisted rebar. His helmet was pushed back slightly, revealing a smudged but earnest face. He moved with a kind of focused intensity that bordered on reckless. And then, it happened. Not another massive explosion, but a sickening groan, a deep, structural sigh from the building itself. The ground beneath Sarah's feet shuddered. A secondary, smaller concussive force, perhaps a pocket of gas catching or a settling of the building's shattered frame, rippled through the air. The young firefighter, still grappling with the rebar, was caught completely off guard. The force threw him backward, not with the violence of the initial blast, but with enough momentum to send him sprawling. He landed hard against the brick retaining wall, his helmet clattering against the rough surface. For a second, he seemed stunned, his head lolling. And then, with agonizing slowness, the wall began to give way. Sarah didn't think. She didn't consciously register the danger to herself. All she saw was a vulnerable human being, a man in a uniform, exposed. The years of drilling, of instinctual response to emergency, took over. She was already moving, a blur of motion, her worn sneakers pounding against the cracked pavement. "Hey, look out!" she screamed, her voice hoarse, swallowed by the roar of the crumbling wall. She reached him in 3 desperate strides. He was still dazed, pushing himself up on one elbow, his eyes wide and unfocused. Concussion, her mind registered even as her body acted. Neck injury, a distinct possibility. There was no time for finesse, no time for careful positioning. As the first large section of brick and mortar detached itself from the main structure, tumbling down with a sickening crack, Sarah threw herself forward. She twisted, positioning her body over his head and upper torso, pulling his helmeted head roughly into her shoulder. The impact was brutal. A searing pain shot through her left shoulder as a jagged piece of brick slammed into it. Another chunk grazed her back, tearing through her thin t-shirt. Dust, acrid and choking, exploded around them, filling her mouth and nose. The sound was deafening, a cascade of grinding stone and splintering wood. She felt the vibrations of the crumbling wall against her body, a terrifying symphony of destruction. She gritted her teeth, burying her face into his turnout coat, the smell of smoke and sweat filling her nostrils. Her arms, surprisingly strong from years of lifting patience, were wrapped around his helmet, holding him as still as possible, protecting his neck. She was vaguely aware of his confused grunt beneath her, his attempts to push her away, but she held on, a human shield against the indifferent fury of collapsing masonry. It seemed to last an eternity, though in reality, it was probably only a few horrifying seconds. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The cascade stopped, leaving behind only the eerie, settling dust and the persistent crackling embers. Sarah slowly, cautiously, pushed herself up, every muscle protesting, her left shoulder throbbing with a dull, insistent ache. She coughed, spitting out grit, her throat raw. Beneath her, the firefighter was stirring more purposefully. "You, what?" His voice was muffled by his helmet, confused. He finally pushed her off, scrambling to a sitting position. His eyes, now clearer, widened as he looked at her. Sarah coughed again, wiping a streak of blood and dust from her forehead. "You all right, firefighter?" she managed, her voice raspy. "Any neck pain? Dizziness? Numbness?" He shook his head, looking utterly bewildered. He pointed a gloved hand at her. "Your shoulder? It's bleeding." Before she could respond, a new, sharp voice cut through the lingering smoke. "Hey, you, lady, get back! This is a restricted zone." Officer Miller, a burly police officer with a face already etched with the stress of the disaster, stomped towards them, his hand resting aggressively on his holster. He hadn't seen the rescue, only a civilian kneeling in the immediate vicinity of a collapsed building and a downed firefighter. His face was a mask of exasperated authority. "Are you deaf?" I said. "Get back! You're contaminating the scene. What are you even doing here?" He reached for her arm, his grip surprisingly tight as he tried to pull her away from the still-dazed firefighter. "This isn't a show, ma'am. You need to—" "Officer!" A new voice, deeper, calmer, cut him off. Battalion Chief Evans, a grizzled veteran with a tired but commanding presence, pushed through the smoke, his eyes instantly assessing the situation. He saw the collapsed section of the wall, the stunned firefighter, and Sarah, covered in dust and blood, a defiant, protective stance still lingering about her. "What's going on here, Miller?" Chief Evans asked, his gaze settling on Sarah. There was no anger, only a professional assessment in his eyes. "This woman was right in the middle of it, Chief. Interfering. We can't have civilians," Miller started, his voice rising in frustration. "She saved my life, Chief," the young firefighter, now fully alert, interjected, his voice surprisingly firm despite the residual shock. He struggled to his feet, gesturing towards the collapsed section of the wall. "That wall went, and she covered me." He took off his helmet, revealing the firefighter, Dave Ortega, his face pale and smudged. Chief Evans's eyes narrowed as he looked from Dave to Sarah, then to the jagged hole in her t-shirt where blood was beginning to soak through. He saw the determined glint in her eyes, the professional way she was already assessing Dave. "She's a nurse, Miller," Chief Evans stated, his voice even, cutting through the officer's bluster. "Off duty by the looks of it, but still a nurse. She did what any one of us would hope someone would do." He turned to Sarah, a flicker of something close to respect in his weary gaze. "You all right, ma'am? Nurse?" "Jenkins. Sarah Jenkins," she replied, a little breathless, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving behind a dull ache in her entire body. I'm fine, Chief. Just a few scrapes. He needs a full workup, though. Possible concussion, certainly neck and spine precautions until cleared. He took a nasty hit to the back of the head, even with the helmet. She gestured towards Dave's still wobbly gait. Just then, paramedics, pushing a gurney, finally made their way through the debris. Chief Evans waved them over. Ortega, get him checked out, neck and spine. This is Nurse Jenkins. She was here. Listen to her assessment. Miller, chastened, stepped back, grumbling under his breath about civilians getting in the way. But Chief Evans' words and Dave Ortega's quiet confirmation had shifted the narrative. Sarah, despite her dust-caked face and bleeding shoulder, was no longer a liability. She was a hero. As the paramedics gently guided Dave onto the gurney, he looked back at Sarah, his eyes still holding that bewildered gratitude. "Thank you," he mouthed, his voice still a little hoarse. "Thank you, Nurse Jenkins." Sarah just nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The initial surge of adrenaline was now being replaced by a profound weariness, the pain in her shoulder growing more insistent. She watched as Dave was wheeled away, another life saved, another crisis temporarily averted. She was just a nurse, after all. It's what she did. She turned to walk back towards her house, towards the relative quiet of her ruined garden. It wasn't until she saw the gaping hole in her own retaining wall, the very wall that had crumbled and then served as the backdrop for her heroic act, that she felt a new, chilling wave of dread wash over her. The foundation of her grandmother's house, her sanctuary, looked precarious. Very precarious indeed. The world, it seemed, wasn't done demanding its pound of flesh. The adrenaline of that day on Elm Street faded slowly, leaving behind a residue of deep, aching bruises and a fatigue that settled into Sarah's bones. Her left shoulder, stitched and bandaged, was a constant, throbbing reminder of the falling bricks. But physical pain was a familiar language to her. She could parse its syntax, understand its demands. It was the silence that was unnerving. For 3 days, she heard nothing from the hospital. Not a call from her unit manager to check in, not a note from HR. Just a void where the familiar rhythm of her life used to be. She told herself they were busy, that the explosion had flooded the ER, and everyone was overwhelmed. It was a flimsy comfort. The summons arrived on Friday morning, not as a phone call, but as a sterile email with a subject line that felt like a diagnosis. Mandatory meeting, Incident 8-12. It wasn't from her supervisor. It was from a name she'd only ever seen on mass distribution policy memos. Arthur Henderson, Office of Risk Management. She arrived 15 minutes early, her clean, pressed scrubs feeling like a costume. Henderson's office was on the executive floor, a hushed, climate-controlled world away from the controlled chaos of the ER. The room was immaculate, decorated in shades of corporate gray. A single, abstract painting hung on the wall, a splash of blue that seemed to mock the room's utter lack of passion. Mr. Henderson himself was a perfect match for his office. He was a man in his late 50s, with a suit so sharply tailored it looked like it could draw blood, and hair so perfectly coiffed it seemed immune to gravity. When he gestured for her to sit, the movement was precise, economical. There was no warmth in his eyes, only the cool, detached assessment of a biologist studying a specimen under glass. "Miss Jenkins," he began, foregoing any pleasantries. He folded his hands on the polished surface of his vast mahogany desk. A single file, with her name on it, lay perfectly squared in front of him. "Thank you for coming. We are here to discuss your actions during the municipal gas line incident on Tuesday." "Of course," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I assume this is for an incident report. The firefighter, David Ortega, I heard he's stable. No spinal cord damage, which is a relief." Henderson offered a tight, dismissive smile that did not reach his eyes. "The health of the firefighter is the concern of another hospital, and is, for our purposes, immaterial. What is material, Miss Jenkins, is the considerable liability exposure you created for this institution." Sarah blinked. "Liability? I don't understand. I was off duty. I acted as a first responder." "You acted as a hospital employee," he corrected, his voice smooth as ice. "You identified yourself as a nurse. You performed a medical assessment. You did so outside of a clinical setting, without proper equipment, and without a physician's order. You physically engaged in a rescue operation, which is not within the scope of your practice or our insurance coverage. Have you considered what would have happened if you had inadvertently worsened the firefighter's condition, if your intervention had led to paralysis? The question hung in the air, cold and accusatory. Sarah felt a flush of anger creep up her neck. What would have happened, she said, her voice dangerously quiet, is that he might have been paralyzed anyway, or killed by a collapsing wall. There was no time to consider. There was only time to act. And that, Henderson said, leaning forward slightly, is precisely the problem. The hospital has protocols for a reason. They exist to protect our patients, our staff, and the institution itself from the unpredictable variables of human impulse. You bypassed all of them. He opened her file, though he didn't seem to need to read from it. Your actions, however well-intentioned you may believe them to be, were, from a risk management perspective, reckless. They have opened us up to potential litigation from the city, the fire department, and the firefighters' family themselves, should any complications arise. Sarah stared at him, aghast. They're calling me a hero, a sentiment that, unfortunately, does not hold up in a court of law, Henderson countered smoothly. Therefore, pending a full internal investigation into your breach of conduct, you are being placed on paid administrative leave, effective immediately. You are not to report for any shifts, nor are you to have contact with hospital staff regarding this matter. You will turn in your ID badge at the security desk on your way out. The words hit her like a physical blow. Administrative leave. Investigation. It was a corporate execution, delivered with the sterile precision of a surgeon. She felt the floor drop out from under her. This hospital wasn't just her job, it was her life, the place where she made a difference, the place where she belonged, and it was casting her out, not for a mistake, but for her finest moment. You can't be serious, she whispered, the fight draining out of her. I am never anything but serious when it comes to the welfare of this hospital, Henderson said, his tone final. He closed her file with a soft, definitive thud. That will be all, Miss Jenkins. She walked out of his office in a daze, the hushed carpeting swallowing the sound of her footsteps. The world had tilted on its axis. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, the crisp scrubs suddenly feeling like a liar's uniform. She surrendered her badge to the guard at the desk, the plastic rectangle that had given her access and identity for 12 years, and walked out into the glaring afternoon sun, unemployed and utterly betrayed. The drive home was a blur of traffic and numb disbelief. When she pulled onto her street, the sight of the yellow caution tape still cordoning off the block jolted her back to the grim reality. Her own home, the place she was seeking for sanctuary, was part of the disaster zone. Taped to her front door, flapping gently in the breeze, was a sheet of glaring, neon orange paper. It looked aggressive, hostile. Her heart sank. It wasn't a notice from the gas company or a flyer from a restoration service. In bold, black, merciless letters, it read, "Unsafe structure, do not enter, order to vacate." Beneath the heading, a litany of municipal codes were cited, followed by a summary in cold, bureaucratic prose. Pursuant to the inspection conducted on 8/13, the structural integrity of the foundation and retaining wall of this property has been critically compromised. The structure is hereby condemned and deemed unfit for human habitation. As she stood there, rereading the words that were actively unmaking her life, a white city-issued sedan pulled up to the curb. A man in a crisp polo shirt with a municipal logo embroidered on the chest got out, a clipboard in his hand. He had a flat, impassive face and the weary posture of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked, his voice a monotone drone. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark Davies, City Code Enforcement. Just following up on the notice. I need to confirm you've received it and understand its terms." He didn't make eye contact with her, his gaze fixed on the cracked foundation of her porch. I don't understand," she stammered, gesturing vaguely at the house. "The explosion. It wasn't my fault." "Fault is not the purview of my department, ma'am," Davies said, clicking his pen. "My purview is safety and code compliance. Your property is currently in violation of City Codes 7, B, 4, and 11, C, 2, regarding structural stability. It presents a clear and present danger to public safety." He spoke as if reading from a script he'd recited 1,000 times. "But what am I supposed to do?" The question felt childish, pathetic, but it was all she had. He finally looked at her, his expression unchanged. "As the property owner, you have two options. Option 1. You have 30 days from the date of this notice to submit a licensed engineer's report and a contractor's plan for the complete demolition and rebuilding of the compromised structure. All permits must be filed accordingly. demolition, rebuilding. The words were so enormous, so financially cataclysmic, she couldn't even process them. 30 days? That's impossible. I don't have that kind of money. My job? She trailed off, the fresh wound from Henderson's office too raw to explain. Which brings us to option 2, Davies continued, unfazed. If no plan is submitted within the 30-day window, the city will contract for the demolition of the property to eliminate the public hazard. The total cost of the demolition, plus administrative fees, will then be placed as a priority lien against your property. He finally looked her in the eye, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not malice, but a profound, soul-crushing indifference. He was a cog in a machine, and she was just a piece of paper on his clipboard. "You have a good day now, ma'am," he said, ticking a box on his form. He got back in his car and drove away, leaving Sarah standing alone on the cracked sidewalk, clutching a piece of paper that had just sentenced her home to death. Her grandmother's house, the place where she'd measured her height on a doorframe, the place where the scent of baking bread still clung to the kitchen walls, was now just a violation, a problem to be erased. For the next week, Sarah lived in a cheap motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. She spent her days in a state of frantic, desperate activity, her life reduced to a series of phone calls. Each call was a small battle, and each battle was a stinging defeat. But the most important fight, the one she pinned all her remaining hope on, was with Apex Home Casualty, her insurance company. She had been a loyal customer for 12 years. She had never missed a payment. She believed, with a naivete that now seemed almost comical, that they would be there for her. This was what insurance was for. After a week of being passed from one department to another, of retelling her story to a dozen different disembodied voices, she was finally on the line with him. Agent Thompson, the senior claims adjuster assigned to her catastrophic event case. His voice was a marvel of cultivated empathy. It was smooth, calm, and deeply reassuring. He used her first name. He told her he understood how stressful this must be. He was a master of the sympathetic prelude. "Okay, Sarah," he said after she had once again recounted the entire saga from the explosion to the condemnation notice. "I have all the reports in front of me, the cities, the preliminary damage assessment from our field agent, and I've reviewed your policy in detail." "So, what's the next step?" Sarah asked, a fragile tendril of hope beginning to sprout in the wasteland of her week. "When can the engineers come out? How does this work?" There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. It was a carefully calibrated hesitation, designed to prepare the listener for a soft landing. "Well, Sarah, this is a somewhat complex situation. As you know, the damage stems from the municipal gas main explosion. Our first point of reference is Section 9, Subsection 3 of your policy, the force majeure clause. It states that the company is not liable for damages resulting from widespread civil infrastructure failure, which this unfortunately falls under." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What? But the whole point of insurance is for disasters." "I completely understand your frustration," Agent Thompson said, his voice a soothing balm of practiced lies. "And we do cover many disasters. However, this specific type of event is listed as an exclusion." "But," he continued, before she could protest further, "we did look into the damage to your specific property, hoping to find an avenue for coverage there." Hope, foolish and stubborn, flickered again. And this is where it gets more complicated. The report notes the collapse of your retaining wall as the primary cause of the foundational damage to the home itself. That wall, according to the city records, was original to the property, nearly 70 years old. "It was a solid wall," Sarah insisted. "It never had any problems." "I'm sure it was," Thompson said placatingly. "But the crux of the issue, Sarah, and I truly am sorry to have to be the one to tell you this, is found in Section 12, Subsection 7. Contributory negligence. The field report contains witness statements from a police officer, I believe, and your own account that you were physically interacting with the wall during its collapse." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Interacting? I was shielding a man! I was saving his life!" Her voice cracked, a mixture of disbelief and fury. "I understand. From a human perspective, your actions were incredibly noble," Agent Thompson said, his tone unwavering. "From an insurance perspective, however, the policy is very clear. By applying your body weight and force to a structure already compromised by the initial blast, you materially contributed to the manner and severity of its collapse. The policy does not cover damages to which the policyholder has directly contributed, regardless of intent. I am so sorry, Sarah, but Apex is going to have to deny your claim. Silence. A vast, roaring silence filled Sarah's head. She could hear the hum of the motel's air conditioner, the distant sound of traffic, her own ragged breathing. She had been punished by her employer for her heroism. She had been condemned by her city for being a victim. And now, she was being abandoned by the very company she paid to protect her, using her single greatest act of compassion as the legal weapon to destroy her. Are you still there, Sarah? Agent Thompson's serene voice oozed through the phone. She couldn't speak. She just held the phone, shaking, as the last pillar of her world crumbled into dust. She had lost her job, her home, her savings, and now her last shred of hope. She was alone, adrift in a sea of policies and protocols, a hero to everyone but the systems that held her life in their hands, and they had just squeezed, crushing everything she had ever worked for. She finally lowered the phone, the connection dying with a soft click, leaving her in the deafening silence of absolute ruin. The world for Dave Ortega came back in fragments. First, the sterile white of acoustic ceiling tiles. Then, the rhythmic, electronic beep of a heart monitor, a sound as familiar to him as a fire truck's siren. He felt a dull ache at the base of his skull and a stiffness in his neck that spoke of heavy-duty precautionary braces. He remembered the roar, the feeling of being thrown like a rag doll, and then a confusing pressure, the scent of dust and something vaguely floral, and a woman's voice, strained but clear, shouting, "Look out!" His crew from Engine 12 filled in the rest. They sat around his hospital bed, their faces smudged with the memory of the fire, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a subdued concern. Sully, a bear of a man with 2 decades on the force, recounted the story with a tone of reverence Dave had never heard from him before. "The whole damn wall came down, kid," Sully said, his voice gruff. "Would have crushed you flat. We all saw it. This woman came out of nowhere, used herself as a damn shield, took the whole thing on her back. A nurse, they said," added Marco, the youngest of the crew. "She was off duty, just lived in the house with the wall, stayed with you, kept your neck stable, gave the paramedics a full report before she'd even let them look at her own injuries. Doc here said if she hadn't protected your head and neck, that second impact," Marco trailed off, shaking his head. "A debt." The word settled in Dave's mind, heavy and solid. In his line of work, debts were sacred. You pulled a brother out of a flashover, he owed you. You covered his shift so he could see his kid's recital, he owed you. But this was different. This wasn't a brother in turnout gear. This was a civilian, a stranger, who had unhesitatingly thrown her body in the path of destruction for him. It was a debt of a magnitude he couldn't yet comprehend, and it consumed his thoughts as he recovered. "We have to find her," he told Chief Miller a few days later, his voice raspy but firm. "We need to thank her. The whole battalion needs to thank her." The search proved more difficult than they expected. The address was easy to find, the whole block was still a restricted zone. But the house was empty, taped off and silent. When they called the hospital where she worked, a clipped HR representative informed them that, due to privacy policies, they couldn't confirm her employment status or provide any contact information. It was a bureaucratic brick wall that only stoked their determination. It was Sully who finally broke through, calling in a favor from a desk sergeant he knew at the 17th Precinct. The sergeant, after hearing the story, quietly slipped him the contact number listed on the incident report. It was for a seedy motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with peeling paint and weekly rates. The detail landed like a stone in their stomachs. Heroes weren't supposed to end up in places like that. Dave, now discharged with a stiff neck brace and a pocketful of pain pills, insisted on going himself. He, Sully, and Marco drove over to the condemned house the next afternoon. They had called ahead, and Sarah had agreed to meet them there. She'd said she needed to pick up a few last things from the porch. In the back of Sully's pickup truck was a large gift basket filled with fruit, coffee, and pastries, and a handsome, custom-engraved plaque from the station. To Sarah Jenkins, with the eternal gratitude of FDNY Engine 12. They felt it was the least they could do. They found her by the side of the house, next to the ruined rose bushes. The woman they saw was not the decisive, fierce protector Dave remembered from his hazy recollection. This Sarah Jenkins was a ghost of that woman. She was thinner, her face pale and drawn. Dark circles hung under her eyes, which had lost their fiery spark and now seemed hollowed out by exhaustion. She was listlessly placing a few salvaged gardening tools into a worn cardboard box, her movements slow, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Dave's heart ached. This was what a hero looked like a week later? Nurse Jenkins? Sarah? He called out softly. She looked up, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition, a faint light, returned to her eyes. She managed a weak smile. Firefighter Ortega. Dave, it's good to see you on your feet. Only because of you, Dave said, his voice thick with an emotion that surprised him. He walked closer, extending his hand. We don't have the words to thank you. You saved my life. I wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for you. I'm glad you're okay, she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. Truly. Sully and Marco came forward, adding their own heartfelt thanks. They presented her with the gift basket and the plaque. She held the heavy wood and brass plaque in her hands, her fingers tracing the engraved letters. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek, but her sorrow seemed too vast for the simple gesture to penetrate. It was Marco, ever observant, who broke the spell. He gestured with his chin towards the bright orange notice still plastered to her front door. Big renovation plans? Must be a headache dealing with contractors after all this. Sarah let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. Something like that, she said, her voice cracking. Dave looked from the notice to her face, a dawning horror on his own. Sarah, what's going on? And so, the story spilled out. Standing beside the ruins of her grandmother's garden, with the scent of dust and decay in the air, she told them everything. She spoke not with anger or self-pity, but with the flat, defeated tone of someone recounting a long, losing battle. She told them about the hospital's risk management department, about being put on leave for a breach of conduct. She told them about the city inspector and his 30-day ultimatum to demolish her own home. And then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she told them about the insurance company, about the soul-crushing cruelty of the contributory negligence clause that had twisted her heroism into a liability. The three firefighters stood in stunned silence, the cheerful gift basket now looking like a mockery at their feet. They were men who dealt in a world of physical courage, of clear rights and wrongs. This world of bureaucratic cowardice and legalistic loopholes was alien to them, and infuriating. They looked at the condemned house, at the plaque in Sarah's hands, and at the broken woman standing before them. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a foul taste in the back of their throats. Sully's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his cheek. Marco was staring at the house, his eyes blazing with a cold fury. Dave looked at Sarah, at the woman who had saved him without a second thought, and felt his gratitude metastasize into a white-hot rage. The system had failed her. All the systems? No, Dave said, the word low and dangerous. No, that's not how this story ends. He looked at Sully, then at Marco. A silent, instantaneous understanding passed between them, the same kind of non-verbal pact they made before kicking down a door and charging into a fire. They had come to thank a hero. They were leaving with a new mission, to save her. The firehouse of Engine 12 was a place of controlled chaos, but when Dave, Sully, and Marco returned from meeting Sarah, they brought a different kind of storm with them. Their fury was a low, simmering thing, more dangerous than any flashover. They bypassed the locker room and the kitchen, heading straight for the open door of Battalion Chief Evans' office. The chief looked up from a stack of paperwork, his tired eyes taking in the thunderous expressions on his men's faces. Ortega, he said with a nod. Good to see you out of that brace. What's wrong? There was no preamble. Dave laid the story out, his voice tight with a rage he could barely contain. He told him about the hospital's cowardly betrayal, the city's merciless bureaucracy, and the insurance company's soulless, legalistic cruelty. He finished by holding up the heavy plaque they had failed to deliver with any real meaning. We went to thank her, Chief, and we found her with nothing left. They're taking everything from her because she saved my life. Chief Evans listened, his face impassive, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He had been with the FDNY for 35 years. He had seen men broken by fire and by grief. But he hated, with a righteous passion, seeing good people broken by the cold, grinding gears of the system. He looked at the plaque in Dave's hand, then at the determined faces of his firefighters. He leaned back in his squeaking chair and was silent for a long moment. We can't fight an insurance company's legal department, he said, his voice a low rumble. And we can't march into a hospital's boardroom. That's not our battlefield. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Dave's. But a house is just a structure. It's wood, nails, and wire. That's a battlefield we understand. A slow smile spread across Sully's face. They want to demolish her house? The chief continued, a dangerous glint in his eye. Fine. We'll save the city the trouble. We'll be the demolition crew, and the construction crew, and the plumbing and electrical crew. He swiveled in his chair and turned to a large calendar on the wall. This is a rescue operation, gentlemen, and it starts Saturday. The message that went out that evening wasn't an official order. It was something far more powerful. It spread through off-duty text chains, union message boards, and late-night calls between stations. The language was simple. Engine 12 is calling in a debt for one of our own. A civilian nurse saved Ortega's life and lost her home for it. We're rebuilding it. 600, Saturday. 418 Elm Street. Bring your tools. Bring your gloves. Bring your brothers. Sarah spent the rest of the week in a fog of despair. The 30-day deadline loomed like a guillotine. She had made arrangements to put her grandmother's furniture into a long-term storage unit she couldn't afford, and was looking at applications for studio apartments an hour outside the city. On Saturday morning, she drove to the house one last time, planning to salvage the last few photos and memories before it was all turned to rubble. She was sitting on the cracked porch steps, the useless plaque in her lap, when she heard it. The low rumble of a heavy-duty engine. A large pickup truck, the kind contractors use, turned onto her street. Then another, and another. Within 5 minutes, a convoy of trucks and vans, filled with men in worn jeans and FDNY t-shirts, had lined the entire block. Doors opened and a small army poured out. Men of all ages, from grizzled veterans with salt and pepper hair to young rookies barely out of the academy, began unloading tool belts, ladders, generators, and coolers with practiced efficiency. They were a legion of competence and quiet resolve. Sarah stood up, her heart hammering in her chest, tears blurring her vision. Chief Evans, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, walked up her crumbling pathway. He handed one to her. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and steady, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "Looks like you've got a bit of a structural problem here. Good thing you know some people who are good at breaking things and putting them back together." Dave was right behind him, his face beaming, the shadows of the past week completely gone. "We owe you a house, Sarah," he said simply. "It's the least we can do." The work began with the focused chaos of a 5-alarm fire. With near-military precision, crews swarmed the property. A team of experts in structural collapse carefully and methodically began the demolition, salvaging every reusable beam and piece of hardware. Another team was already working on clearing and leveling the ground. The sounds of hammers, saws, and cheerful, profane shouts filled the air, a symphony of reconstruction that drowned out the silence of despair. By midday, the phenomenon had captured the neighborhood. An elderly woman from across the street came over with a tray of sandwiches. A young couple a few doors down set up a table with pitchers of lemonade and iced tea. The story spread. A local news van, tipped off by an anonymous call, arrived and began filming, the reporter speaking in hushed, awestruck tones about the incredible scene unfolding. The manager of a large hardware store chain saw the midday news report. An hour later, a flatbed truck from his store pulled up, loaded with lumber, bags of concrete, and boxes of nails. "This is on us," the manager told a stunned Chief Evans. "You tell us what else you need." The firefighter's simple act of goodness had become contagious. Late in the afternoon, as the new foundation was being framed, the dreaded White City sedan appeared at the end of the street. Mr. Davies got out, his face a thundercloud of bureaucratic indignation. He marched towards the property, his clipboard held in front of him like a weapon. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice straining to be heard over a generator. "This is an unsanctioned construction site. I am issuing an immediate stop work order. You have no permits, no plans." He was stopped short by Chief Evans, who stepped forward to meet him at the property line. The chief wasn't angry. He looked almost bored. "Afternoon, Mr. Davies," he said calmly. He was holding a thick, 3-ring binder. He handed it to the inspector. Davies opened it, his smug expression slowly dissolving into slack-jawed disbelief. Inside, neatly organized behind plastic tabs, were dozens of pages. Stamped, signed, and approved permits for demolition, for foundation work, for framing, for plumbing, for electrical. Every E was dotted, every T was crossed. "But how?" Davies stammered. "These take weeks, months." "Turns out," the chief said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "the deputy commissioner of city planning owes a few of our guys for pulling his mother out of a car wreck last year." He was more than happy to expedite the paperwork for a fellow hero. "We are following every single one of your codes, Mr. Davies. To the letter. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're losing daylight." Defeated and utterly outmaneuvered, with the news camera capturing his humiliation, Davies could only retreat. He got back in his car and drove away, a petty tyrant vanquished by a brotherhood with longer memories and stronger loyalties than any city ordinance. A loud cheer erupted from the assembled firefighters as his car disappeared around the corner. It was a victory for all of them. The story of the firefighters' rebuild was the lead segment on the nightly news. The headline was devastatingly effective. Abandoned by city, hospital, and insurer, local nurse who saved firefighter is rescued by his brothers. The footage of dozens of off-duty heroes working in the sun, contrasted with the image of the humiliated city inspector, created a public relations firestorm. The dominoes began to fall the very next morning. The first call was from a senior vice president of public relations at Apex Home Casualty. Her voice was frantic. She didn't even try to defend Agent Thompson's decision. She spoke of a terrible misunderstanding, a misapplication of a complex policy, and offered Sarah a full and immediate settlement that was nearly double the original value of her home to cover all damages, materials, and emotional distress. It was blood money, an attempt to silence a PR nightmare. But Sarah accepted. The check would ensure her new home would have the best of everything. The second call was from the president of the hospital. He was profoundly apologetic. Mr. Henderson, he explained, had been reassigned to a non-public-facing role to reassess institutional protocols. Sarah's administrative leave was retroactively erased from her record. She was offered her job back, with back pay and a promotion to head nurse of the emergency department. "We failed you, Sarah," the president said, his voice heavy with contrition. "And we would be honored if you would lead the team that you so clearly exemplify." She accepted, a new, unshakable confidence in her voice. The system had tried to break her, and in failing, had given her power over it. Weeks turned into a month, and the house rose from the ashes of the old one. It was built with a level of care and precision that no contractor could ever match. Every joint was perfect, every wall was true. It was a monument to gratitude, built by calloused, loving hands. The housewarming party was a loud, joyous, sprawling affair. The entire block seemed to be there, along with firefighters and their families from a half-dozen different stations. The backyard was filled with laughter, the smell of barbecue, and the sound of children playing. In the middle of it all, Dave Ortega, now fully recovered, stood on the newly built back deck and called for quiet. He raised a bottle of beer. "We have a tradition in the FDNY," he said, his voice ringing with emotion. "When we enter a burning building, we look out for each other. We are family. We leave no one behind. Sarah, you weren't wearing our uniform that day, but you acted like one of us. You ran towards the danger to save a brother." He gestured to Sully, who came forward holding a gleaming red firefighter's helmet, just like their own. On the leather shield on the front, where a number would normally be, was a single, beautifully painted word, Jenkins. "You saved one of us," Dave continued, his voice thick. "So you got all of us. Welcome to the family, Sarah. This house is built on a solid foundation, but our gratitude for you is stronger than any concrete." The crowd erupted in cheers as Dave placed the helmet in her hands. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, could only laugh, a pure, unadulterated sound of joy. She was home. Months later, life found its new, beautiful rhythm. As head nurse, Sarah ran her ER with a fierce compassion and an unwavering intolerance for bureaucratic nonsense. She was a better nurse, a better leader, because she had been forged in a different kind of fire. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 year after the explosion, she found herself kneeling in her garden. The rose bushes, salvaged from the wreckage, were blooming again, their deep crimson petals a vibrant testament to resilience. Her new retaining wall, built by Sully himself from solid riverstone, stood as a symbol of unshakable strength. She ran her hand over the small, bronze plaque the firefighters had installed next to her new front door. The engraved words shone in the afternoon sun. "Built with gratitude for a true hero. Engine 12. She had once believed in systems, in policies and insurance, in the neat, orderly structures that were supposed to protect people. They had all failed her. They had crumbled like the old brick wall, revealing the rot of indifference within. But in the rubble, she had found something far more real and infinitely stronger. She had found a foundation not of concrete or clauses, but of community, compassion, and the stubborn, beautiful loyalty of a family forged in fire. And that was a home that no force on earth could ever condemn.